The Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment System is a new assessment designed to more validly measure what students with significant cognitive disabilities know and can do. This presentation will provide an overview of the practice of shared reading with students with significant cognitive disabilities. This training, Shared Reading, is one in a series of trainings that support teachers of students with significant cognitive disabilities in their efforts to teach and assess. Sponsored by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, this training is part of the professional development efforts of the Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment Consortium. In this training, you will learn about a specific approach to reading that can be used with students with significant cognitive disabilities. This approach, shared reading, is appropriate for a wide range of students at any age. It helps students who are not yet interested in reading books and/or have not yet developed intentional or symbolic means of communication. It is also appropriate for students who have these skills and even may be reading words in text, but are still learning to make connections with and comprehend text. Shared reading can help students build their vocabulary, background concepts, knowledge of print and braille, text comprehension, and their ability to communicate using speech or some form of augmentative and alternative communication. What is shared reading? Very simply, shared reading is the interaction between an adult and a student or a group of students while they read a book together. Shared reading is focused on interaction and meaning making. It is not just an adult reading a book to a student or a group of students. Instead, during shared reading, the goal is for the student or students to eventually direct the interaction by labeling pictures, asking questions, making comments, and directing the way that the adult navigates through the pages in the book. Along the way, the adult typically reads most of the text, but is also likely to point out pictures, discuss words, connect the words and pictures to the student's background knowledge and experience, and generally follow the student's lead to maximize engagement. While the goal is for the student to lead the interactions during shared reading, it starts with teachers guiding students, encouraging their engagement and interaction, and supporting communication. There is a strong research base for the use of shared reading in early or emergent literacy development. In 2010, the National Early Literacy Panel identified shared reading as a key predictor that contributed to students' later success with conventional reading and writing. In addition, several studies support its effectiveness with students with significant cognitive disabilities. Shared reading provides a context through which adults can naturally model concepts about print, including the one-to-one correspondence between a spoken and written word, reading from left to right and top to bottom, turning pages, and generally how to interact with a book. The adult also has the opportunity to model how we make meaning from print when reading words rather than pictures. Shared reading helps students build receptive and expressive language skills, or speaking and listening skills as they are described in college and career readiness standards. Shared reading helps students learn new vocabulary because books use more diverse vocabulary than spoken language. This is especially true for information books. Shared reading helps students develop skills like phonological awareness, which is awareness of words, rhymes, syllables, and sounds within words. Shared reading supports expressive communication as students learn to label pictures, ask questions, comment, protest, and connect the book to past experiences. Shared reading helps students learn about all aspects of receptive and expressive language. In a nutshell, shared reading focuses on maximizing interactions between the adult and students on a page-by-page basis while reading. It involves lots of exploration and interaction around the illustrations and words. As a result, there are potentially numerous barriers for students with significant cognitive disabilities. This is especially true for students with multiple complex disabilities and those who have combined hearing and vision impairments. For students with significant cognitive disabilities, The biggest barrier to successful interactions during shared book reading is often limited communication. Many may not be able to rely on speech to communicate, or can only use a handful of single words to communicate. These students need a means of communication that enables them to interact during shared reading on a page-by-page basis. Another potential challenge for students with significant cognitive disabilities is a lack of access to good, age-appropriate books. These challenges and others often result in limited opportunities to engage in shared reading for most students with significant cognitive disabilities, especially those who are older. However, these barriers are not insurmountable, and the Dynamic Learning Maps project is offering supports to address them. First, students need a way to communicate during shared reading if they are going to develop both receptive and expressive language skills. The Dynamic Learning Maps First Context Survey suggests that nearly 10% of students with significant cognitive disabilities do not have a means of intentional communication. It tells us that another 20% have very restrictive use of single words or symbols to communicate for a narrow range of purposes. Shared reading can help all of these students develop more sophisticated communication skills, but they need additional supports. Symbol-based communication offers one type of support. The number, type, and arrangement of symbols in a communication system varies depending on the individual student needs. Historically, we had provided students with communication symbols that allowed them to label the main characters in the story or recite a repeated phrase. This approach certainly maximized interactions during a shared reading event, but we have learned that it limited language learning over time. The story-specific communication boards we provided had little use when we moved to a different book or to different contexts. Just how many times do you encounter a purple cat in real life? A core vocabulary approach offers an important alternative. A core vocabulary is comprised of a limited set of words that are highly useful across many different contexts. The vocabulary in a core system allows the student to express many different types of messages, and also allows the teacher to expand the student's messages. For example, if a student wants to take a closer look at the page of a book, the student might select the message, "Look," and the teacher could then point to the words, "want look," while saying, "You want to look." Most importantly, the core vocabulary words students learn to use while interacting during shared reading are words that are useful across contexts as, for example, students asked to look at things or ask others to look at them. Some students may have difficulty physically accessing a communication system with multiple messages. In this case, you might provide the student with a single message voice output device, but you'd want to program comments that are meaningful across the text and have meaning in other contexts. The important point is to make sure that the time spent engaged in shared reading helps students develop communication and interaction skills, as well as understandings of single words or messages that can be used across contexts. This is the example of a core vocabulary that you've seen before. You might use this core vocabulary during shared reading. You could use different symbols to represent the vocabulary words, and you might even need to use tactile symbols for students with significant visual impairments, and symbols that depict sign for students who use sign language. Think of the words or phrases that a student could express during shared book reading with the vocabulary represented on this overlay. A student might point to "I do" to indicate having done something similar to what is in the book. They might point to "What is it?" to ask a question about a word or illustration, or point to "not like" or "not want" to indicate an opinion. Other examples might include "want more," "like it," "go," and so on. During shared reading, the teacher, or more knowledgeable other in the interaction, has many things to juggle. In a classroom, Teachers often have to juggle these things for a whole group of students. You might find that you have to practice shared reading with 1 or 2 students at a time before you can juggle these demands with a small group. The things that need to be juggled include encouraging communication at all times. This requires the teacher to follow the student's interests and attribute meaning to each communication attempt. In other words, the teacher has to work to make connections between the comments offered by the student and the content of the book being shared. During shared reading, the teacher also has to work to connect the content of the book to the student's personal knowledge and experience. Teachers have to model how to communicate using the student's communication symbols and talk about the thought process they engage in while deciding to make a comment. Finally, teachers have to make good choices about the books they share. The right book, coupled with a good set of messages, can dramatically increase the interactions during shared reading. When students first begin participating in shared book reading, it may be difficult to keep them engaged and interactive. Using objects during shared book reading may help students become more engaged. If nothing else, the research suggests that incorporating objects can increase the amount of time students will engage in shared reading. However, the objects are also intended to help students make connections with the book and support their interactions while they learn more about shared reading, receptive, and expressive language. Objects might include a real item or a representation, such as a toy or a miniature object. Objects could also be picture communication symbols, or duplicates of illustrations from the book, or laminated versions of the flaps in Lift the Flap books that we sometimes call pull-offs, as students can pull them off or put them into the book. In the Dynamic Learning Maps alternate assessment system, many ELA items begin with a shared reading interaction. Teachers are asked to engage with students in a shared reading of the text that will be used in the assessment before the student is then asked to reread the text in order to respond to questions. For example, this is the first screen in a testlet assessing a 4th grade essential element in reading literature. The essential element states that students will use details from the text to describe characters in the story. Note that the teacher is asked to gather objects they have been using during instruction with the book, Omachaius the Helper, and then they're instructed to read the story with the student, maximize your interactions with the student, point to objects and pictures while you read, lead with comments such as, "Look at the baby," while pointing to the picture. After you read the story, you will read the story a second time and answer some questions. Sometimes, the DLM essential elements specifically reference familiar text as a condition under which students will accomplish a skill. For example, in 2nd grade, there is an essential element in reading information text that reads, "Answer who and what questions to demonstrate understanding of details in a familiar text." In addition to DLM essential elements that specifically reference familiar texts, students who have the most complex disabilities and are accessing essential elements at the initial precursor level will always use familiar text during the assessment, as in the Omachaius the Helper example you just saw. All familiar texts that will be used in the assessment are available to teachers and teams through the DLM website and eventually the DLM assessment system. As a result of this emphasis on familiar texts, teachers have access to a free, universally accessible set of books that relate directly to the books that are used in general education classrooms. In addition to this library of familiar text offered by DLM, teachers should look for other books to use during shared reading. We typically read each book across several days before we move on to others, but even with repetition, shared reading requires a broad range of books. There are many factors to consider when selecting books to use during shared reading. Length and complexity are 2 issues to address immediately. Select books that are short enough that they can be read and reread in a single session, and make sure that the language complexity of the book is a good match for the student. Too often, we select books based on the topic and end up sounding like the teacher on Charlie Brown as we read on and on to students who don't understand what we are reading. At the same time, consider students' interests and experiences when selecting books. There will be much more to talk about if you select a book that you can relate to your students' knowledge base and interests. Finally, if you have students who cannot see pictures in books, be certain to select books where the bulk of the story is told by the words and not by the pictures. Many picture books use the illustrations to tell the story. Even with good textual support, students with significant visual impairments who are emerging in their understandings of literacy will find it very hard to comprehend a book in which the story is told through the pictures. It is important to note that all texts being offered by DLM meet each of these demands, except the connection to individual student interest. The books in DLM are all short, use simple language, reflect the books used in general education at each grade level, and carry the meaning in the words, not the pictures. Because it is not possible for DLM to know or predict the individual interests of students, teachers play an important role in selecting these books from sources other than the DLM collection. As we conclude the module on shared reading, keep in mind that shared reading is a powerful activity based on interaction and engagement around books. Students are not expected to comprehend the entire story or to respond to comprehension questions during shared reading. Instead, they learn how books work, develop important expressive and receptive language skills, and learn to make connections with text that will support their comprehension of text over time. For more information about the Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment System, please go to www.dynamiclearningmaps.org. Thank you for your participation.